I'll give it a couple of minutes to let everyone gather in here. Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia Mitchell, and I am the Senior Operations Manager. On behalf of the National Glass Association, thank you for joining today's Thirsty Thursday webinar featuring Lance Davis. Today, we will be discussing glazing performance requirements in U.S. federal policy. You'll hear how one agency in particular has taken an industry-leading approach to establishing building design, construction standards, and performance requirements. Before we dive in, just a few quick reminders. Today's webinar is a replay from this year's Glass Conference in Carlsbad, California. If you're interested in attending the next Glass Conference, mark your calendars for September 29th through October 2nd in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And don't forget, there's still time to register for BEC Conference happening March 2nd through the 4th in Las Vegas. This is a premier event for education and networking in the glazing industry. For more details or to register for upcoming events and webinars, visit glass.org and check out the events menu. Please note that there will not be a live Q&A at the end of this session. If you have any questions, please email Amber Johnson, ajohnson@glass.org, and I will be sure to put her email in the chat. With that said, let's get started.
We have Lance Davis. He is the
My apologies for the technical difficulty. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm going to restart the webinar and you should be able to hear it this time around.
Sustainable Policy, Performance and Tools. He has a Bachelor's of Architecture from Mississippi State University, where he is a fellow. He's also a fellow of the AIA as well as the USGBC. He chaired the LEED Steering Committee for the development of LEED version 5 and was on an ASHRAE decarbonization task force focusing on carbon sequestration. He is appointed to President Biden's Climate Smart Infrastructure Working Group, co-authored Sustainability Matters, and is featured in the book, The Rise of Living Architecturals. Please let's welcome Lance Davis.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to hopefully keep you awake after lunch, keep you engaged with everything amazing there is in federal legislation. Isn't that the most exciting topic? This is me, and the reason, and I have to do a disclaimer, I am here as Lance Davis, a federal, expert. I am not here representing my agency, that I work for. I am on vacation. So any reporters in the room, I'm not here in any sort of federal capacity. So just want to make sure that's very clear. All right. And getting into some of this, there's these four objectives that I'm planning on hitting on, which is understanding some of the sustainability legislation that's out there and why it's important to the glazing industry. Interpreting some facility standards that are used by federal agencies, discussing what federal projects need from a glazing standpoint, and then a little bit of what might be happening from a future perspective as it relates to federal policy in glazing. And recognize too, that last bullet, I was editing that yesterday. I haven't looked at the news today, so that may have changed by now. But I'm doing the best I can with what I have available. So. All right, there it goes. Okay. This is just to give you a sense of the size of the federal government and what's going on from a contracting perspective. The government spends a lot of money. We all know this. And one agency in particular that really focuses on buildings, which is the General Services Administration, has contracts roughly $25 billion, of which about $7 billion goes towards buildings. That's operations and maintenance, that's renovations, that's new construction each year. So a good chunk of change going towards buildings in general. And so it's good to sort of know where to find all of this and to understand that if you're not familiar with GSA, all of this information, by the way, is publicly available on websites, easy to find. I've just boiled it all down, put it in one place for you. So the inventory, it is the GSA is sort of the real estate arm of the federal government. They do a lot of courthouses, land ports of entries, office buildings, roughly 363 million rentable square feet throughout the United States and the territories. So just to give you a sense of their size, this is sort of to, these are the types of buildings that the federal government owns. Up here, we've got land ports of entry there, historic properties up in Boston, interesting office buildings for NOAA. We've got the second largest planted roof in the world on the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters. This interesting project in Miramar, Florida. Lots of historic properties. About a third of the inventory is historic properties. And in addition, there it is. We don't do the residents, that's taken care of by the Park Service, but the offices of the White House are taken care of by GSA. So just to sort of give you a sense of what's out there, some really beautiful buildings, some really great places to work in the federal government there. If you're interested in federal jobs, this is the website that you need to know, sam.gov. And you can get your marketing person or you or yourself or whoever. You can get an account, you open up, you register, you get an account, login. And then what's great about it is you can actually set up searches. And so if you're interested in aluminum extrusions in Minneapolis, it will send you an email whenever a contract is let with something like that in it. It will also notify you when a major project is awarded. So HOK just got a new courthouse in Indiana, and you want to go now sit with HOK and talk to them about how your products can be useful for this federal project. It will alert you to things like that as well. So great tool, take advantage of it. It's got some really good search engines. They notify you automatically, saves a lot of the headache of trying to go through millions of contracts. So and it does it for multiple agencies, multiple types of work. As you saw on that earlier, that first slide, a lot of money being spent. GSA is not the only one spending it on buildings, so it's a great one to sort of keep track of what's going on. So the first highlight that we're going to really hit is getting into this sustainable federal legislation. And this is, I meant to update this a few months ago and add probably 2 more pages to it, dealing with executive orders that were in place at the time. Fortunately, I didn't, because at the beginning of this administration, those executive orders were rescinded. So, but this is a pretty hefty list of laws that are out there that it sets the baseline of what a federal building has to do. Okay. And it's small for a reason, because there's a lot there. And this is our starting point. This is our baseline. And we're going to hit some of those highlights just to give you a sense of where we're starting from. Because in some cases it's pretty bold. In other cases, we've sort of, the various agencies have looked to raise the bar some because it makes financial sense. And we'll talk a little bit about that along the way. So some of the aspects in this federal legislation, and it's important to note, a lot of this legislation has now been around for 20 plus years. So 5 different administrations coming through the White House. And I want you to notice some of the key terms up there. Efficiency, effectiveness, longevity, integration and synergy of systems, healthy, conserving materials, and resiliency. These aren't buzzwords for, the political parties. These are appropriately taking care of buildings for the long-term ownership, using our tax dollars to do that with. And so that's why I partly think this legislation has been around. These pieces of legislation have been around because they talk to both sides of the aisle. It's about the federal government taking care of really great buildings in the best possible way that we can, and thinking about those buildings for the long term. 100 plus years is our typical ownership. So in these legislation, the earliest one we have that we really deal with is EPAC, the Energy Policy Act 2005. And the few things that it hits on, and I really love the presentation earlier this morning, sort of talking about how all of these things are integrated. You may be asking yourself, why is he up here talking about greenhouse gas or HC efficiency or renewable energy? Because they are all work together. And we'll explain that a little bit better as we go forward. But in EPAC, we have looking at sequestration of greenhouse gases, maximizing air conditioning efficiency, having a renewable energy incentive, metering all of the federal buildings, and then having a portfolio level energy plan. So when we look at the energy used by a particular agency, they look to lower it by a certain percentage each year, and has that been met? The next is ESA, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. And this one gets a lot more interesting. So right now, we have a requirement that federal buildings being constructed have to have 90% fossil fuel free reduction. So basically a good bit of electrical supply being supplied to these buildings. That number goes to 100% by 2030. So 5 years. 5 years, no fossil fuel in federal buildings. So just want to, it's an interesting thing of how do you take a very large federal building and remove fossil fuel from it, make it efficient and performing. Other aspects in there are getting to definitions of zero net energy, looking at lighting efficiency. We must use sustainable design principles in there, and we'll get into more because that leads into other things that have been set in motion by this legislation. We have to do an energy evaluation of our portfolio, of a quarter of our portfolio every 4 years. So how is it doing? We expected it to be achieving this. Is it actually doing that? If not, why not? Commissioning is required. So looking at those systems, how are they working? That's also been rolled out to building envelope commissioning. So we see that a lot of times happening. OMB Office of Management and Budget is required to develop a sustainability scorecard to score the agencies on how they're doing, actually achieving all of this. That then becomes public. Everyone can then see how's EPA doing, how's Department of State doing, how's GSA doing. Reducing end-of-life waste. So when we are renovating that building, we have to do some deconstruction. What happens with it? What can we do with it? It expands the metering requirement. And then it also sets our baseline. In that earlier presentation, you heard them talking about ASHRAE 90.1. The federal standard is we have to be 30% better than the latest version. So we're using the 2019 version of ASHRAE 90.1, and we have to be 30% better as our starting point. So the point of all that is just to relate how integrated all of these things are. When we talk about an HVAC dependent sort of energy model, for a federal building, it doesn't work that way, because the performance that we're having to get from this legislation requires us to do a much more integrated and synergistic approach where the HVAC, the lighting, and the envelope are all working hand in hand to achieve these performance requirements. The other one that we have out there, fairly new, is the Energy Act of 2020. And it goes on to promote carbon management, looking at how we do both operational and embodied carbon. It expands that definition of zero net energy. We have a requirement for using performance contracting. Everyone here familiar with ESPCs, Energy Service Performance Contracts? Anybody not familiar? Okay, so energy service performance contracts is where basically a owner who doesn't have enough money to renovate their building or to upgrade it can go out to the marketplace, and there are companies out there that will loan the money to the government or to the owner. They come in and they look at all the possible retrofits that can be done, usually centered around energy and water efficiency. And they go, okay, we can, we'll spend $20 million renovating your building. We think we're going to save that in 15 years. You pay us back this plus a fee over those 15 years, and we guarantee you that your energy efficiency will be this. And so they're essentially getting paid back by the efficiency they've brought to the building. So federal government now has a requirement that a good bit of our renovations has to be done by performance contracting. So that's sort of a notification to you that if that's something you're interested in doing, talking to companies out there that do this work, like Amoresco or several others, Schneider and others, that that may be beneficial. So where that you can then look and see what's available, because we have to do a bunch of it. It promotes energy storage. So looking at ways that we can take energy, store it, be more responsible to the grid. Get buildings, grid interactive, efficient buildings. So we want the federal buildings. You heard earlier about the grid and being responsible, and if all of us in the middle of summer are using our AC mid-afternoon, we put a heavy stress onto the electrical grid, and generally they have to crank up another system to help supplant that. it becomes very expensive, it becomes stressful for the grid. And so if our buildings can actually talk to the grid and to the power plants, then everybody can start to level out a little bit. And it lowers that amount that we need at the worst times of the day. And it helps lower the cost overall. So that's an interesting one we've seen happening more. Using microgrids. So we're looking at the ability of our buildings to start to stand alone and be more resilient as opposed to having to be part of these bigger electrical grids. And then really starting to leverage more sustainable manufacturing. How are these products being made and being delivered to the site? So out of this concept of having to design to sustainable design principles, out of the sustainable design, to utilize sustainable design came the sustainable design, the sustainable guiding principles, sorry. And so these principles start to lay out sort of that next layer of requirements that are put onto federal buildings. The most important as an architect, for me at least, is employing this integrated design principles. It was a great point earlier today that a lot of times people involved with the facade aren't brought to the table in time, and decisions are being made about the facade that then affect the overall energy efficiency of the building. This idea of integrated design brings more of those people to the table at the right time so that they can bring those ideas together, be bold in their thinking, and make those decisions up front when they can, as opposed to later when the cost potentially goes up. Other simple things or other things you've probably recognized: energy performance, water conservation, indoor air or indoor environment, the environmental impact of materials, and building resiliency. For the federal government, you obviously want most of those federal buildings to be highly resilient, because if you're in an area that might have something happen, like a wildfire or a hurricane or a flood, you generally want FEMA up and running so that they can then distribute the money and get help where it needs to go, right? So resiliency is a very important aspect of this. And then to actually show that we're meeting those guiding principles, we have this sustainable design checklist. And a lot of agencies have adopted certification systems like LEED or Green Globes. So if you show that your building achieves a LEED certification at a silver or higher level, that's one of the ways to prove that you've met those guiding principles to OMB. I know that GSA requires the gold for their projects. Using energy efficient products, including Energy Star, efficient buildings, metering, renewable energy when that's possible. It's not a requirement, but it's an optional item. And then also embodied carbon and resilience again. So that starts to lay out those baseline requirements that we're starting with from the very beginning. So a lot of the agencies have their own versions or have facility standards that we give to design teams that they then utilize to start their projects. This is one that the GSA uses. This is called P100. It's available online, pretty easy to find. And then some aspects about these facility standards that are important to note is that they're mandatory. They're not optional items. They go beyond the I codes. P100 is 360 plus pages of performance and prescriptive requirements above what the I code sets as a baseline. So it tries to really raise the bar, really focuses on those 100-year plus buildings and making sure that we're taking care of them from an operations and maintenance standpoint. we have there's performance tiers in this. So there's a baseline performance tier. So something like for uh, 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 an envelope, you might have a 30-year life expectancy for the facade with a 15-year life expectancy for the seals, right? As your baseline. Then your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 will get up into 50 years for the envelope with a 25-year life expectancy for the seals type of thing. And then it's up to the project manager and design team and the type of project to start to designate in the contract where those performance aspects are, so that you, when you're bidding on it, actually know what you need to be providing. From a sustainability perspective, it is very much about being integrated. And I'll explain that a little bit more in just a minute. Making sure that your systems are synergistic with each other. In some cases, we've reached such high performance levels that now the landscaping, which used to just be plants out on a green lawn somewhere, are now an integrated part of the mechanical system, right? Integrated part of the mechanical system, landscaping. That's where we are from a performance standpoint. If plants are now an integrated part of the mechanical system, where do you think the facade is and all of that? It's a highly integrated aspect of it. And it really is expected to be working hand in hand. Looking at all phases of the life cycle. And actually this is, oh, no, you can't see it up there. Okay, never mind. There's a great picture sort of in the background that you can't see because it's washed out up there, but it looks really good over here on this one. That has a really nice screen in front of the facade to shade from the sun and stuff like that. Looks beautiful, it's wonderful. Until you need to actually get in there and replace the seals on that facade. Now all of a sudden that screen has to come off. Whether or not it was designed to do that very well, I'm not really sure. But it's something that we have to think about. That's one of those aspects of understanding the life cycle for these projects and how it's being taken care of. Obviously, improving the building performance, health and comfort of the occupants. And then, so this is where integrated design comes in. And this is where I want to build up from your talk earlier today, Helen. This idea of cost and performance. So she was absolutely right. Generally, when you raise performance, it generally is raising cost. But you do get to a magical point if you raise the performance enough and you have all of these integrated systems working with each other, that your cost actually starts to go down. Because you've taken a high performance facade, you've integrated it with the HVAC system. Now the HVAC system doesn't have to be as big, doesn't have to be as bold. I can now reduce the cost of my HVAC system. I've integrated it with my lighting, so I don't need as many lights, or I don't need as many fancy controls throughout the building to take care of it all. And all of a sudden that cost starts to go down because now I'm taking stuff out that I don't need anymore because my performance has gotten me up higher. This is where we try to live in the federal government, where that blue circle is, where our costs are lower, but our performance is higher. Eventually, you do get to a point where you are leading edge and you're trying out some crazy new stuff out there and that cost starts shooting back up again. But we're trying to live in that valley right there. So some of the aspects that are in there that I want to make sure that y'all understand or that this is you're thinking about. I know yesterday there was a lot of talk or a session on, I think, embodied carbon and what's happening. We require that Our projects look at doing a 20% reduction in embodied carbon. So we do a whole analysis of the building. What are the materials being specified? How are they using? What is their footprint? And can we reduce that footprint by 20%? Look at simple tools that are out there. Carbon smart material palettes. If you've heard of Architecture 2030, this is a shoot off of that. This is basically saying, hey, here are some real simple materials to take a look at, make consideration of. Glass is in there. And then looking at using tools that are already out there, like the LEED rating system and some of the points they have in relationship to that. And what starts to happen is we find very quickly that when our design teams really start thinking about these projects, that embodied carbon starts to greatly be reduced. So here, you can sort of see a typical building, what its carbon footprint, an embodied carbon footprint would have been. But they renovated an existing building and were able to reduce the carbon footprint by 53%. I'll also note, I meant to put a picture in and I didn't. Edith Green Wendell Wyatt is in Portland, Oregon. And it is a phenomenal facade story. This was a brutalistic style concrete building, thick concrete walls, stripped windows, not a very nice place to work. They stripped off that concrete, put a beautiful facade that is different on all four sides because it has to respond to the sun on all four of those sides, right? Oh, and in the process, getting rid of that concrete over 23 stories, I think, added 1.5 feet of rentable square footage around the entire perimeter of the building. Multiply that by 27 stories, that project, just by the new rent that we get, was paying for itself within 5 years. Okay? Just by redoing the facade to a high performance facade, gaining back space that we could then rent to federal agencies, helped us turn that project into a moneymaker. So great stories like that are things that we look to do, and that's what integrated design does for us. Another one, this is in Denver. This is where we took an existing building and renovating it, and they're now looking at an 87% decrease in materials from embodied carbon standpoint. So it's a very doable thing, being smart about it, thinking about our existing buildings and how they can be reused. Another aspect that we're starting to see pick up in the industry is this idea of construction decarbonization. And I bring this up for a couple items, mainly starting to look at pushing construction off-site, having more construction done in factories where that any waste can then automatically be reused or salvaged or taken care of. Making sure the quality of the work is the highest quality we can expect, that the glazers are actually putting all of the seals in the right way, type of thing. Then delivering it to the site just in time so it can be craned up where it needs to go, be attached and go forward. We're doing also a lot more from our construction and demolition waste, and also salvage assessment. We're recognizing, we're talking to more glass companies that say, hey, you're taking off 1 million square feet of glass when you're doing this renovation. We'd really like that glass back so that we can then lower our embodied carbon footprint, crush it up and melt it and make new glass with it. So those sort of stories help to lower that overall embodied carbon footprint, which we're really excited about. So glazing requirements within all of this. So we're asking glass to do a lot for us. And this is sort of what we see um, in various facility standards out there. I mean, some of this is obviously the basic requirement of what glass does, right? You know, it keeps the wind from blowing inside and it keeps the water out, hopefully, right? Keeps the water out, right? It makes sure that temperature is regulated. Piece here I want to take note of is life cycle costing. We heard a little bit of people talking about this earlier today. You know, we're supposed to do life cycle costing on our buildings and projects. And I think also one of the things I was thinking about, no one understands U value in the public. They understand R value because that's what they're hit with, right? So a window that's an R3 or 4, maybe a little better if you're really, really good, is really hard to justify when you're up against an opaque wall with an R value of 40, right? And so we have to start asking our architects and mechanical engineers and whoever, is it really appropriate to have that window there? Because that's costing me money. That's costing heating and cooling. And it's generally more expensive than the wall that it's next to. So we have to ask ourselves, is that really the best use of that glass and that glazing system? Is it really doing something for the building there? And so life cycle costing is, I push back on a lot of architects because they love doing repetition of windows, and all of a sudden I got a window in a closet, which I don't need, or I've got one in a restroom that they then have to black out. I was like, you're just spending money. Let's be a little smarter about this. Other things, obviously noise and making sure the critters don't get in. Next thing we're starting to really look at from glass and what we're expecting it to do is pass building enclosure commissioning. This is a requirement for a lot of federal agencies. Doing mock-ups is a very, very big deal for us because we want to make sure that the contractor knows how those pieces go together. They do it right. And then we test to make sure that we don't have air and water infiltration coming into that assembly, so where that then they can start putting it on the rest of the building. So that's an aspect that we push really hard. Our baseline expectancy for facade materials starts at 30 years with 15 for the seals. And that's an area we're continuing to think about. How do we, if you think about owning a building for 100, 150 years, that means I'm replacing those seals potentially 10 times, right? Life expectancy would, glass, your facade has a life expectancy. So how do we make that work better for us? How do we think about it and make sure those systems are working better overall? We're also asking glass to deal with daylight. And in a lot of cases, we've gotten away from this concept that daylight means just a window that someone can look out, right? I've got too many federal buildings where people have come in and installed umbrellas over their desks because the sun's beating down on their computer. And one of the things they forgot to do, well, they purposely didn't do, was they installed this big window and they expected the agency to then fund the blinds to go in front of that window to then block out this bright glare that was coming in, right? So we've changed that. That's now all part of the designer's responsibility. They have to think, what do I want happening on this surface? And then how do I design that facade and that blind system or that louver system or that sunshade system, whatever they're doing, they've got freedom to do, but that has to be all part of their package now. They can't separate it out and push it on the agency anymore. Circadian rhythm. So that's really a lighting thing. except it's not. It is all part of that daylighting aspect. We're seeing, we're now installing and working with labs to actually put in lights that change color throughout the day to regulate people's circadian rhythms so that they sleep better and they're more awake at work, right? Well, that takes the aspect of daylighting to be a part of it as well. And so when the lighting and the facade work together to bring in this idea of circadian rhythm, we have a much better solution. Biomimicry. This is actually an interior shot of that Edith Green Wendell Wyatt building. It has vines and trees and stuff growing up the outside on the building. It's pretty cool to see. Definitely the people really like this sense of biomimicry in this building. Bird safe. So this is an item that came in several years ago for us. We worked with the American Bird Conservancy and with NGA to actually put at the time one of the more bolder bird safe designs into our requirements. This is the ABC loves to use the census building because it has this wooden screen on the outside of the building. Looks pretty cool. But that's another aspect that we care about. We're also looking to potentially generate power. Is there that option? There's lots of new materials out there. On a 27-story building, it's really difficult to get all the solar panels you need on the roof. So where else can we integrate them? And then looking to achieve that high thermal resistance. Really starting to understand the U value of those materials. What's the new thing out there that we can take advantage of? I know there's programs for both military, Department of Energy, and GSA that's all about new materials and helping them bridge that technological valley of death where you invent a product, but you haven't gotten it all worked out and tested yet. It's not out on the marketplace yet. So let's use the federal inventory to install some of this in. Let the national labs do a extensive measurement and verification to see if it actually works. Write a report about it that if it does work, you can then use to get yourself across that valley of death there. So hoping to bring more materials to the marketplace. I know I've talked with several of you. Some of you are already in that program. So really excited to see how that works out for y'all. And then also adding in security, including blast and ballistic. Anybody here involved in ballistic glazing? Raise your hand. Okay. Massive issues right now we're having with ballistic glazing. Have a very large study going on in the federal government because it's delaminating in way too many facilities on the northern and southern border. So something to be aware of, trying to figure out what's going on, what's making it happen. It's not the cleaning products. It's something else. So, and when you own as many buildings that need ballistic glazing and you're having to replace it in less than 5 years, it's not a good ownership for the American people. So that's something we need to really get a better handle on. And then listening device privacy, we work with some 3-letter federal agencies that want to make sure that no one's listening into their conversations. So making sure the glass can take care of that. And then starting to get into more recycled content and recyclable, low carbon footprint. Anybody got materials that can do all that for us? Yeah, there we go. I got a hand. All right, cool. That's what we're looking for. That's what the federal government wants. Some version aspect of that. Oh yeah, sorry. And occasionally we also want glass by privacy and artistic expression, right? To do fun things like this on interiors. So one of the things that through the Recovery Act, inflation, the IRA, is we really looked at what should be sort of the embodied carbon for flat glass in relationship to the country and what was available in the EPDs, environmental product declarations out there. And we started setting limits as to where we're starting from. So our first and best case scenarios, we're looking for flat glass whose EPD number is 1,331 metric tons of CO2. Okay. And then if no one can provide that, then moving down in a tier. And if no one can provide that, moving down in a tier. What's been really interesting about this is how the glass manufacturers, some of which are in this room, because I've been to your facility, have actually went and looked at their process for how they were making glass and found ways to start to achieve this just by looking at their manufacturing process, being more efficient and being more effective in what they were doing. And now they're able to provide products that are more in this range for our designers to start to specify. And so that's exciting when you start to see this sort of signal from the federal government and you respond and find better ways of doing manufacturing the products that you make. We don't currently have one out there for aluminum, but I would highly expect that would be forthcoming. That is one of the higher sort of embodied carbon items out there. We also have it for concrete, glass, asphalt, and steel. So just things to be aware of and looking at your own manufacturing process to see how EPDs can make you more efficient in the products that you're making. Also, as part of this, we were requiring the facilities making the glass to have gone through the flat glass manufacturing plant EPI through the Energy Star program, so Energy Star plant aspect. So looking at how much energy they're using in a year, how can they be more efficient and effective. It's the Energy Star program, but it's set up for manufacturing plants. So future direction. All of this sounds great. Have no idea how much of this will stay, but this is where we are today. Few things that I think the National Glass Association needs to be very aware of. And this is the first one. First week, this memo came out that talks about federal public buildings should be visually identifiable as civic buildings and respect regional. That's good. I'm okay with that. Traditional and classical architectural heritage in order to uplift and beautify public spaces and ennoble the United States. So right now, this is a memo. We're told that this will come out as an executive order with even more stringent language to it, but we're not sure. But so we're only dealing with the memo. And what we don't know yet is this what we're talking about? A Roman or a Greek temple set on pediments type of thing? Notice how much glass is in a facade like this? Or are we talking about historic interpreted? This is actually a courthouse going on in Greenville, Mississippi, where they took that idea of classical architecture, thought about how that partie, the rooms lay out and how they work, reinterpreted that into a modern building that still has many classical features, but is vastly different than something like that. I'm not really sure how we achieve a lot of our performance requirements in a building like this, mainly because trying to recreate stone and Greek columns and stuff like that isn't a very inexpensive thing to do unless you're doing it out of cheap fake materials. So we don't know, but that's an area that certainly concerns me as a private citizen, sort of setting the architectural style of the federal government. And I think it's greatly limiting our designers and what they do in localities across the country. So maybe something that the association wants to say something about. And then finally, I think the other thing that's out there is EPDs are still a thing. One of the reasons we think EPDs will stick around is because they really push domestic products. That is a very big deal. We talked about that earlier with the tariffs and all of that. So if you're a local manufacturer in the United States, I know the association deals with Canada and Mexico and others as well, but in the United States, from a federal government perspective, getting materials from the United States is a very, very big deal. And so having EPDs start to give you a technological advantage in all of that, because generally if you can get an EPD and you can show a lower footprint, you're generally doing those materials from the United States and not having to deal with all of the travel of materials across the ocean and stuff like that. We're seeing thousands of new EPDs coming out since 2022. We're finding lots of people out there willing to help, or for a price, I'm sure, but help you get your EPDs done. And the industry is becoming much more knowledgeable about those PRIs, yeah, I think that's what they're, the overall setting of how you go about setting that EPD. So with that, that hopefully gives you a sense of where we're starting from and where we may be going. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to, that takes you to my LinkedIn profile and stuff like that. And got a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions, happy to answer as best as I'm able. If not, we can then go on to the next thing. Yeah.
So I was just curious, how do you plan to enforce or enforce maybe is not the right word, the regional and readily identifiable portion of that you had highlighted in the one slide, of the design consideration, right? How does one interpret that? Because that seems rather nebulous and rather in the eye of the beholder, right?
Exactly. We're waiting for further guidance. We don't have any as of yesterday that I know of. And that's part of the concern. And then what we don't know what this, if an executive order is coming out on that and what that executive order will say.
More to come.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
And an opportunity for people to express their concern about it, and let the powers be know that this is what we think about it.
Highlights, nice presentation, and thanks for all that. Paul Bush from Feature Architectural Glass. One thing I had a question on, the whole EPD and global warming potential with the different categories of acceptance for the products is great. I was wondering, you didn't mention whole building LCA analysis when we get down into the nitty gritty of individual materials. Is there something coming in the future on that, or is that being put off for now?
No, so we have now a whole bill, and it was actually on there. Maybe I just didn't describe it. So we do require our design teams to do a whole building LCA. The problem that we're having is that we're telling them to compare that to a baseline building. And unlike ASHRAE 90.1 that tells you very specifically, here's how you do your baseline model for your HVAC system. And then here's how you model what you're planning to, put in there, and you can compare the two. There is no standard as to what a baseline life cycle cost analysis embodied carbon building is. So we're asking our design teams to take their best guess and do 20% better on that aspect. in that process, we're trying to get them to learn about it, and we're trying to get them to better understand what an LCCA is, and then choosing better materials along the way. So that we expect this will go forward, but right now that's what's in there. So,
Yeah, so we could talk a little bit about the, so, not all products are created equal when it comes to the ratio of the body carbon versus their use things, right? It's about 50-50 a building, about 50% is a body, 50% is use things. But for it's a carpeting, it's almost all body, right? For a window, most of the system. So is there enough nuance made by say, okay, I've heard it, but not so much values.
Yes and no I would say from our really good design teams, which we are able to, in a lot of cases, hire some of the best designers, in the United States. A lot of them understand that nuance. And they present on that sort of understanding that, hey, this is a higher embodied carbon material, but it's lowering your overall operational carbon. And when we look at this sort of total number, that total carbon, it helps lower it overall. And so I've certainly seen presentations like that. I would say glass is still a very high embodied carbon, item. Melting of sand takes a lot of energy, or silica, and so that is definitely one of those top four materials: glass, asphalt, steel, and concrete are sort of the big four that we're looking at. Again, I think aluminum is probably that next item, and then, as you note, though, carpet, ceiling tile, and gypsum board should be the next ones. Because although they don't necessarily have super high embodied carbon, we buy a ton of them. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, how much carpet, ceiling tile, and gypsum board is coming out of a federal building is tremendous. So looking to affect that, and as I said, sort of push the snail from the backside and make a bigger change, that may be where it is. So we use four basic delivery methods: design, bid, build, CMC as contractor, construction manager as contractor, and blanking out where we get it designed up to a certain point. Then that schematic design goes out to bidders in a design bid sort of scenario. The FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, limit what types of contracting we can do, and those have sort of been the general four that we've looked at. I'm not familiar with the assist aspect, but I do know we can't do where the owner, the designer, and the contractor are all entering in a contract together. Yeah, okay, so we can't do that. That's against FAR regulations. Yep. Yeah. Right. Oh, all right, one more.
I think if you gave this presentation and said these are our goals, I'd say, well, that's very utopian. But the fact that you presented all the stuff you're currently doing is almost heroic compared to, I would say, what some of us deal with in the private sector. And where do you see maybe an opportunity to take what you guys are currently doing and teach the masses and almost change how this is looked at, or is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention it. We have 9 of our projects have won AIA Coke Top 10 awards, which is sort of the nation's top sustainability award. for buildings out there. So we're the only owner that has 9, which is very cool for us. And that certainly gets information out to other design teams and to the public to see. We are generally very bad at sort of telling good stories outside of our own sort of internal group. I have my own personal theory about that, but I personally would love to, help tell more of those stories. I mean, the Edith Green and the Wyatt story, I think, is a phenomenal story that very few people know. I mean, we've got other stories, of, land ports of entry that are sort of getting to this concept of safety and security in very harsh environments, but in a beautiful and loving way, and respecting the people that are coming back and forth through those land ports of entry. Instead of sort of dealing with things with guards and guns, we're dealing them with beauty and security that you don't actually recognize as security. So it's, so we'd love to better figure that out. I just haven't done that yet, or haven't done it very well, maybe. So
I think Lance just now volunteered to be part of that glass marketing group. So it's fabulous. He just did that. Thank you, Lance, very, very much. We have Lance Davis.
We went a little bit over time, so thank you guys for hanging in there with us. As a few quick reminders before we go, today's webinar is accredited for one AIA-LU, and a link to the quiz will be sent to the Thirsty Thursday follow-up email. You can also find the quiz and a recording of this session at glass.org/architects by Friday. A recording of this webinar will also be available at glass.org/webinars by Friday. In the meantime, feel free to browse our library of free presentations anytime. And finally, mark your calendars for our next Thirsty Thursday on March 20th, where we will dive into the Window and Door Market Survey Insights with Chris Beard from John Burns Research and Consulting. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.